country has never been so prosperous. As the Prime Minister has said, the standard of living has gone up.
As Britain turned the decade into the 60s, life looked thoroughly agreeable. This was the world, as Prime Minister Harold Macmillan assured us, of glossy magazines. The country played a new game called hire purchase, and women now going out to work for the first time for real money were having a spending spree all their own. This was the era of the second car. In suburbia, scores of semis sprouted two-car garages and posh tar-macadam drives. They told us we'd never had it so good.
Pleasant Valley Sunday in the 60s, and Triumph, like most other car makers of the day, were busy trying to woo the well-heeled middle classes. But they knew that their Ditchwater Dull Standard 8 wasn't going to win any hearts or any races. What they needed was a car with sex appeal. And this is what they came up with: the Triumph Herald. Bright, cheerful, and terribly chic, 60s suburbia fell in love with the Herald at first sight. It had espresso bar Italian styling, swish duotone paint schemes like cactus and conifer, and the sort of British uprightness that made it respectable yet daring at the same time. Whereas the Mini and the Anglia had the common touch, cars for the people, the Herald was aimed firmly at those with an eye for the good life.
In a Triumph Herald, you can really follow your inclinations. It's the most go-anywhere car in its class. Thanks to all-round independent suspension, the wheels soak up the bumps, while you soak up the scenery. There's a very quick gear change, too. It can only be the Triumph Herald. Ask your dealer for a trial drive.
For years, Triumph's smallest car kept them solvent and found nearly 600,000 eager owners. Crisp, neat, classy and rather glam, the talk of Tupperware parties all over the home counties, the Herald is the perfect personification of 60s middle-class Britain. But it hadn't always been handsome. In early '57, Triumph's designers came up with this sad creation called Zobo. Rightly greeted with a resounding raspberry by Harry Webster, Director of Engineering, he asked an inspired young Italian stylist, Giovanni Michelotti, to improve it. But even he had his work cut out.
On my way down on holiday in Italy, I called in on Michelotti to see if he'd made any improvement to our design, and he hadn't, and he couldn't.
Was ready to go. And by 1958, Webster had come up with a crazy stunt of driving two Heralds all the way from Cape Town to London.
Into the Belgian Congo and onto the dust, which for 7 weeks did its relentless best to seek out any weak spots in the Herald's sealing and lubrication without success. This was a British expedition, and come what may, the British way of life was scrupulously followed.
The little cars coped valiantly with few mishaps, even negotiating the Sahara Desert. But the real object of the exercise was to drum up some big noise PR for the forthcoming launch.
And for the day, it was really a very theatrical send-off held here in the grandeur of the Albert Hall. Packed to the rafters with 2,000 excited dealers, the handsome new Herald was revealed to a fanfare of trumpets. Few luxury liners, let alone motor cars, had ever had such a tumultuous send-off.
This was indeed something to sing about, and something to dance about, too.
At the launch with the dealers, the reception was ecstatic. It really was. I think the dealers were suitably tanked up by the time that the covers were lifted off the cars all round the floor of the Albert Hall. But when one sees a car for the first time as a dealer, the looks are absolutely vital. And with the Herald, the looks were right. But the highlight of the evening was the building of a Herald in 3 minutes. Now, initially, of course, when we built this car, it took us a long time back at the works. And gradually, by modifying the car, getting very skilled at the movements, we were able to get it down so that it was a sparkling performance by the team of 4 apprentices. And when the boys had completed it, I came down onto the stage, escorted a young lady into the car, started the car up, demonstrated that everything worked, and in fact, instead of loading it onto a lorry and driving it off to another show, I actually drove this car right the way across Europe, virtually as the boys had assembled it.
In all their publicity, Triumph made a big play of the Herald's separate chassis, but actually the chassis was one of the few parts of the car that wasn't thoroughly modern.
Now, publicly, Triumph said this was a good thing because it gave the body more rigidity. But in private, the truth was more prosaic. In the late 50s, the British motor industry was working at full tilt, so there was no one who had the capacity to build a one-piece body shell for Triumph's new baby. There was no room at the inn for the Herald, so a separate chassis is what it had to be.
Got myself a crying, talking, sleeping, walking, living doll. Got to do my best.
But it made up for its old-fashioned underpinnings in other ways. That clean-cut shape had only 10 curves. It sat on all-round independent suspension, had the turning circle of a London taxi, plus a collapsible steering column. Priced at £702, it was 200 quid more than the Mini and 100 more than the Anglia. But nobody minded. The middle classes loved its upmarket image and bought it by the thousand.
Believe what I say, just feel.
My husband had this Jaguar, and of course I needed my own little runaround for shopping, and this was the ideal car for the job. It isn't too bulky. The Jaguar was big and bulky, the Mark 10 in those days. It was a beautiful car, but this was even better for me, because being a woman, I like a nice little nifty car with a sporty look, and this visor here was an optional extra in 1959, which my husband kindly bought, and it's been a great help when the sun is out, which other cars haven't got. The beautiful design, the balanced design of this car was missing on the old Fords and the old, I had an Austin 7 at one time, but it didn't have any personality, but this had personality. It made me feel like a woman goes out feeling well-dressed, or she's not well-dressed. I felt well-dressed when I was driving around in this car.
In that first year, Triumph built 27,000 Heralds, but could easily have done double. The problem was they couldn't build them fast enough, and when they tried, there was a legion of quality control problems. Seats collapsed, exhausts and switches fell off, and there were even tales of the headlining becoming unstuck and literally draping itself over the driver's head at speed.
And one of the main complaints in the early days, of course, was that they used to fill up with water. So we get the odd humorist who would come in with his wellies on and his feet on little blocks on the floor to keep them out of the water. And we would then try and sort his problems out. Another difficulty was with the door locks, which used to jam. And we would get somebody perhaps coming in, and he would sit there quietly in his car, and people would look at him and he would look at us, and then we would say, "What's the matter?" "Oh, I can't get out of the car." So they would rush off and get a few mechanics from the workshop and lever him out with various tools and equipment.